Hi there guys, this is Richard, your host, with another marvelous video. Punisher's hyper-violent, mind-scarring origin story, explored in detail. American comic books have always crafted their stories and themes with children and teens as their target audience. In fact, the term comic itself refers to humor and comedy. Nevertheless, with the passage of time, certain comics went on to opt for a more mature tone in the works. It was targeted towards adult readers with themes of graphic violence, profanity, sex, and nudity, similar to the mangas in Japan. Following the growing popularity of DC after creators Neil Adams and Denny O'Neil delved into deeper topics like racism, sex, and poverty, there was an influx of a more mature audience. Marvel also had its fair share of themes pertaining to topics such as death, but they really developed into this subgenre with the arrival of Max Comics into the scene. Max Comics is an imprint of Marvel itself and is targeted towards a mature audience. They successfully gained popularity after specifically producing uncensored content. This brings us to the Punisher series. The Punisher is an anti-hero with an origin story where gangsters gun down his wife and children in front of him. Maria! The Punisher was always a much more cutting-edge character compared to his contemporaries in the Marvel comics. Unlike other heroes, he had no trouble killing. Rather, that's where he excelled. But Garth Ennis' take on the Punisher in Born really cemented him into the dark realm of unabashed violence. Despite being created by Jerry Conway, many would agree that it was the Northern Irish writer Garth Ennis who really did justice with the nuanced character of Frank Castle. Fans have often observed how he is like the shadow side of Captain America. Following the defeat of Hitler in the Second World War, Captain America became a symbol for hope, pride, bravery, and heroism. On the contrary, the Punisher is symbolic of the rage and negativity that took a toll on the soldiers and America itself as an aftermath of the Vietnam War. Frank Castle is not the first comic book character to experience the loss of loved ones. In fact, this by itself is a recurring backstory several superheroes have had. But his loss has resulted in him into seeking vengeance, and Ennis brilliantly dives into his psyche and exploits that, telling his readers how everything wasn't sunshine and flowers in Frank's mind even before his tragic loss. The violence was always burning within. In Born, Garth Ennis takes us to the origin before the origin, to the time when Frank Castle served in the Vietnam War, and shows us the darkness that was already present within him. Frank could have stopped with his violent antics after killing those associated with the death of his family. However, he doesn't. Ennis shows us that something is not right with Frank in the first place, and the incident with his family only acted as a trigger for the violence that was already embedded within him. With Born, Frank accepts himself as a killer while being a part of the Vietnam War. Before diving into the content, we'd like to request our viewers to subscribe to Marvelous Videos. Like and comment on our videos and press the bell icon to be notified whenever we upload a video. We'd be grateful to you, and we hope to bring you the best nerdy content. And with that, let's get right into this video. The gruesome events from Frank Castle's final tour in Vietnam. Frank Castle serves in the United States Marine Corps as a captain. The year is 1971, and the 4-day incidents have been documented during his final tour in the Vietnam War. Garth Ennis exposes and narrates the story through the eyes of a young Marine named Steve Goodwin. The first issue opens with an illustration of Frank Castle himself, where his skin is disintegrating, exposing his skull. As the story begins, we see a plane coming towards the Firebase Valley Forge, an outpost for the U.S. Marines located at the South Vietnamese-Cambodian border. As it nears the soldiers, it gets shot at by guns, and the wing subsequently takes a terrible hit. It crash lands and explodes. The Marines decide to go after Charlie, the Vietnamese who caused this. Steve Goodwin takes center stage as he talks to himself about how desperately he wants to board a plane and leave the hellhole of a battlefield. He wishes to sleep in peace as beautiful stewardesses offer him food and cold beer. He never wants to return, unlike other combat junkies who are here for a second or third tour, implying that some just like to partake in violence, such as Frank Castle, a man who is seemingly in love with war. However, Goodwin believes that Frank's caliber and abilities are necessary for their survival. Since Frank's arrival, the soldiers of the patrols he led have not been killed in action, not out of his love for the soldiers, but due to his survival and killer instincts. Goodwin talks about Frank's exploits during the first 2 tours in Vietnam, where stories of his killings were too horrifying but nevertheless true. This is where Garth Ennis first sheds the light on Frank Castle's psyche, preceding the unfortunate event of his family's death. Frank was always messed up. A man who killed without breaking a sweat. A man who was in love with war. The Marines camouflaged themselves around a stream and bushes when a group of Vietnamese soldiers passed by the front, alongside a herd of rhinos. The Marines rained fire on them, shooting them and throwing grenades at them mercilessly. They're at war after all. The illustration is far from being sugar-coated or PG-13, as it depicts people being shot as their intestines spill out. That's Max for you. Goodwin enters his internal monologue once again, where he talks about having sons one day with the woman he finds the most beautiful. He wishes for them to grow up to be strong as he shows them America, the greatest country in the world, a land full of hopes which is supposed to be the real America, unlike the blooded America in the war. The scene shifts as we see Frank Castle in a room with Colonel Ottman, a man with absolutely no empathy and a serious alcohol problem. Frank updates him with the incidents of the day and reports to him regarding the ammunition available or the lack thereof. The colonel tells him that General Patton would be making a visit for a surprise inspection. Anytime someone comes to inspect the base, the colonel fakes contracting malaria, and with the same old excuse, he assigns Frank the task of giving the general a tour of the base. The general and Frank converse regarding the colonel's absence due to malaria. The general disses the colonel's abilities due to the sorry state of the base with its unmanned bunkers, rusted artillery, and abuse of marijuana cigarettes. Frank tells him about the valley being unmanned half the time and a severe lack of ammunition and equipment. The general wants to close down the base, even though Frank's outpost was the only U.S. outpost that looked over Cambodia. The general expresses how cuts have to be made, and can be made as the war at the forefront needed a lot more support than this outpost. He threatens Frank by saying that if Frank were to oppose him, he'd be kicked out of the Marines, and the closest he would then get to a Vietnamese enemy would be via the television news. Hearing this, Frank seeks to settle things with the general. He tells him that he has concrete proof that will guarantee why the Valley Forge outpost must remain functional. He takes the general to a ridge and asks him to get atop to find what he is looking for. Nearby, a signpost reads, "Danger, sniper at work, dawn to dusk," and it was dusk. As the general stands on the ridge, looking for whatever Frank asked him to let at, he is shot dead by the snipers. The Marines make fun of the general for not reading a sign, while Frank has a dark inner monologue with himself. It reminds him that the general is right about the base being too messed up, but Frank could not let go of his life as a soldier of war because he craved violence. It made him feel alive. It tells him that Frank will one day have to pay a price for his acts of killing. With this, writer Garth Ennis teases the event that later goes on to become the origin story of The Punisher. The second issue opens with an illustration similar to that from the first one, but this time, Frank's skeleton has disintegrated further. His helmet takes color as mold forms around him while his skull has been infested with maggots. Angel from the Marines is seen doing heroin. He is summoned by Goodwin, who takes him outside while he is high. They get into a verbal altercation with Garcia and Coltrane due to the money transactions regarding heroin. Frank enters the scene and inquires whether Angel was clean or not. Goodwin stands up for him and says he was, but at that moment wished to face Garcia and his sharp razor instead, as Frank was a much more terrifying man to face. The platoon moves forward. It comprised the last 29 Marines from Valley Forge who cared to hunt down the enemy. Everyone had a motive for being here. Tedrow liked to throw grenades and MacDonald had a bag of scalps. Goodwin himself was here to be there for Angel, while Frank was simply a man who loved war and its horrors. Goodwin could have stayed with the others from the valley, but he chose to be with the platoon. They were all expecting to run into Charlie and his North Vietnamese army. He was the one who had caused the plane to crash. They came across some Vietnamese soldiers who attacked the Marines. The two sides face each other off and the platoon has a hard time keeping up. As casualties increase on the American side, Frank picks up a gun and shoots at the enemy. At this point, it's hard to say which one is the machine, the gun, or Frank himself. He kills the enemies by himself while the others look in shock and bewilderment. Frank's instincts are fired up as he shoots until his enemy's body is tattered with holes from bullets. As Goodwin thinks about the payback the Vietnamese had to face right now, an internal dialogue within Frank talks about a worse payback that is to come. The Marines find a Vietnamese woman trying to kill herself following their defeat. She's bleeding while her legs are broken and shirt torn apart. MacDonald sees this as an opportunity and decides to rape her, but Frank points the sniper at her and kills her. MacDonald moves to a nearby stream to wash off his blood and drink water, as Goodwin hides behind a nearby tree and prays for a jet to rescue him from the hell of war. Frank arrives at the scene and steps on MacDonald's head, forcing his head under the water. He dies from Frank's punishment. Goodwin witnesses it all and doesn't mention anything about this event to the rest of the platoon. Everyone believes McDonald to be missing. Later, as Goodwin drinks alcohol, Frank approaches him, inquiring what made him not give out the details to the others. Goodwin is startled to know that Frank knew and asks him what made Frank kill McDonald. Frank mentions that he wanted to punish him. This is a more direct reference to Garth Ennis pointing out how, even before becoming the Punisher, Frank Castle felt the need to punish the offenders in a gruesome manner. It was as if he wanted to hand out the judgment himself. Frank tells Goodwin that he did not need to be afraid of him, but Goodwin couldn't help it. And yet he needed Frank to survive in the war. He kept justifying his actions by mentioning this bit about his survival. As for Frank, killing the Vietnamese victim was his way of helping the girl out, because had she survived, she would be handed over to intel where the men would take rounds raping her. The third issue opens with the same illustration of Frank, but this time it's much more grim than the first two illustrations. The skull is not present anymore. It is his disintegrated face and helmet, but it is a shell in itself which is on fire. The first few panels depict ruckus around a Vietnamese bridge where the Americans drop bombs. Others burn down the houses of the Vietnamese, throw them in ditches and shoot at them, or light them on fire with their weapons. Goodwin retrospects on the effect this has on America as the rest of the world goes on to hate them. But in the end, they cannot lose. Even though they already are. They do this so that when others in Southeast Asia look at the condition of Vietnam, they'll not dare to mess with the United States again. In a way, it guarantees safety for the American citizens following their apparent loss in the war. He asks Angel why the United States cannot stay out of the business of other countries. Despite having everything as a country, such as a bustling economy, adequate jobs, a high standard of living, and anything anyone from the third world can only imagine, they still meddle in war with others. Before he can get his answer, they see two planes flying high nearby, possibly Vietnamese. Ottman speaks with Frank, who is troubled by how much the unit has thinned out following the ambushes by the Viet Cong. There's exponentially less ammunition. The outposts are undermanned, and the battle is severe on the home front. Ottman confesses that he never requested for resupply as it was pointless. The war was almost over, and the United States was heading towards its defeat, and the American soldiers were tired. They just wanted to go home. A major reason why Vietnam won the war in the real event was due to their territorial advantage, which they used to its utmost extent. This is depicted in this issue as Frank tells Colonel Ottman about the weather being perfect for the enemy's attack. The colonel seems like he just does not care anymore. As Frank walks by himself, his dark internal monologue comes back. He ponders over not killing the colonel like he did with the general in the first issue. After all, the colonel didn't care about their victory as much as Frank, and the ends justify the means. Or maybe it's just a phrase people use after committing atrocities for a good cause. Frank probably wanted to kill to lead the people better. Or he probably wanted to kill because he considered the colonel to be a bastard. His monologue dives deep into his psyche as he reflects over killing people at the drop of a hat because he believes he deserves to hand out judgment and punishment to the others. Every time the monologue comes back, Ennis unravels more and more layers to Frank's dark personality, revealing more about how he has always felt and the violence that burns within his soul. He meets Goodwin, who eases the springs of the magazines and tells him about how everyone did not feel the same way about wanting to go back home, referring to the people's lust for violence. Frank tells him about having a family. Goodwin is surprised, but Frank tells him that they might be his last chance, maybe at a redemption, even though he does not say the latter outright, but it is implied. Meanwhile, it rains heavily, and Frank recognizes how they really did not have a chance of winning this one. Frank's internal monologue takes over again, and chides him for getting into a somewhat emotional interaction with the softest heart in the platoon. And it reminds him that it was his last chance and not his family. It was what Frank needed to accept to be his real self. Goodwin notices Coltrane, who deals heroin to Angel. He knocks him unconscious and takes Angel away. He points out that Angel will be taking a drug addiction home following the war when Angel reaches his tipping point. He points to an obvious situation that does not favor him at all. As Goodwin tells him that he has a lot to live for, Angel claims that Goodwin can go back to a normal life with his college education and a girl next door while Angel goes back to his ghetto where he can die any second. Goodwin tells him about how the Americans shouldn't have gotten involved in this war and that this wasn't real America when Angel bursts and explains how the real America is one where people like Angel were shot down by people like Goodwin, called racial slurs, and how the American dream was not real for the black man who only got the shorter end of the bargain. Just then, they are attacked by the Viet Cong, who completely dominate the battlefield. Bombs take over the fight as there's destruction all around. Frank calls for having the 60 handed over to him. The fourth issue opens with an illustration of Frank's face, but this time his skull-like face has turned into skin as he covers it with his blood-stained hands. Goodwin narrates the story of a great beast, which is symbolic of man's violent nature that awakens on the battlefield. He speaks about how the beast still remains at large even after the end of war, and when it does not get to fight, it grows hungry, which is why in every generation, Americans go to war even though they do not need to. And it does not come from wanting to defeat others. The beast requires blood to be shed. It does not matter whether the blood was the enemy's or America's. And this battle was the one where America's blood would be shed. Maybe it was payback. The platoon fights with Frank at the forefront. They were unable to contact anyone due to the storm. The two sides fire at one another even though the Vietnamese clearly dominate this one. Angel talks about how there's no God because of the horror he witnesses on the battlefield. Coltrane sneaks up on Goodwin with a razor to his throat, asking for Angel while referring to him with racial slurs. Frank attacks him from behind and takes Goodwin with him. They realize that almost everyone else was dead. Goodwin rushes behind Frank, thinking that he wasn't going to make it even though he thought he would. A plane flies over his head and drops bombs. The place explodes. Goodwin is dragged into an airplane where he is greeted by beautiful stewardesses. As he had visualized, he cries happily, telling himself that he made it. However, he didn't. The explosion had killed him. Frank shoots at the Vietnamese by himself. His inner conscience points out how he had been shot over 4 times already. He asks Frank to think about why he did what he did. He asks Frank what made him come back to the war thrice despite its horrors. As Frank kills an enemy, he asks himself what he did look for if not this exact feeling of killing. He tells him that if he admitted to it, he would get what he wanted, but of course, for a price. Frank admits to wanting a war that lasts forever. Day breaks and more soldiers come to rescue any survivors in the battlefield. There weren't any, except Frank, who looks like a zombie at this point, but he still stands. He returns to America with a bandage around his arm and a crutch. His wife, son, and daughter receive him. He tells his family that he will never be going back to war again. His inner monologue returns. It mentions how Frank won a couple of medals and due to accepting his agreement was able to kill 24 men, soak up 7 bullets, and still survive. However, he had to pay a price, as mentioned before. The illustration zooms into his family. It reminds Frank to enjoy his time with his family, but it was too late to turn anything around. Frank hugs his family tightly at the end. It is unclear whether the monologue is actually another entity, his conscience or his shadow self, even though the latter two seem more probable as the series remains too grounded in reality for it to be a separate entity striking a deal with him. It is similar to concepts such as karma or the law of equivalent exchange. One states that you get what you give, while the other states that to get something, you have to give away something of equal value. And what better way to balance the scales for relentless killing but taking away those Frank Castle holds the closest to his heart. Its prominence increases with each issue as the events of all 4 days unfold. What starts out as something that teases Frank's lust for violence and having to give up something in return to have this lust fulfilled grows into something that consumes him as he kills the Vietnamese soldiers during the 4th day, all by himself. The 2 during a fight that was completely lost. Because why else would anyone go into a killing rampage in a lost battle? Unless they craved this exact sensation. And since this is what his heart desired, he was able to give in to it once again following the death of his wife and children. It was an instinct he had suppressed to not lose his family after realizing that his killings were bound to cost him their lives. So when that was out of the equation, he allowed himself to be consumed by it once again. With Bourne, Garth Ennis added several more layers to Frank Castle's personality, developing an origin before the origin and making him much more gritty, realistic, and complex. He crafted Frank Castle like an onion and then peeled him layer by layer, exposing his deepest and darkest side to the readers. What did you think of these 4 issues? Did you enjoy this video? If yes, then don't forget to like and comment on this video. Till then, goodbye and have a nice one.